When I was in college and in graduate school, actually, I found it really challenging to wrestle with hard questions that were at the intersection of science and faith. And this was in large part because I did not really find a lot of safe spaces for me to ask these questions, right? So whether it was in Christian circles that I was in, I felt like I was expressing doubt and being a skeptic, and that people weren't warm to that. Or if I were in the scientific circles pursuing a PhD, it wasn't always friendly. If I was interested, if I was a seeker or interested in spiritual things that went beyond the material world. So it felt as though there weren't spaces. So I'm so grateful for what Veritas does, and I wasn't really aware of it at the time. I've been doing forums like this for the 10, 11 years, and I'm incredibly grateful for this space that Veritas creates for us to wrestle with hard questions that don't have pat answers, right? So I'm not up here to give you answers to all the hard questions in science and faith, but rather maybe to just spur the discussion or provide some kind of channels that we can pursue together and give you a little bit of insight based on the wrestling that I've done and the experience that I have. But ultimately, I see this as an invitation to you all to wrestle together with me. So I hope you see this evening that way. And I'm also keenly aware, I have a 50-degree change today. I was telling Alex, I woke up, it was 35 degrees where I was in Ithaca, New York. And I touched down at GSP, and it was 85. So I'm a little disoriented. But at any rate, it's so beautiful outside. I'm aware that you could be doing other things, and so I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend your time with us here today. So the title of my lecture, as you can see, is Stardust and Wonder. And one of the questions that I want to start by tackling is, what has science taught us about who we are, about human uniqueness or distinctiveness? I want to highlight 3 lessons from science. And at first, especially for those of you who may identify as Christians here, those lessons may seem bleak, but I want you to track with me and stick with me, because I think at the very end, I hope to have convinced you that, particularly viewed through the lens of Christian faith, that these lessons are actually not bleak, but quite inspiring. So the first lesson from science is that we are not as biologically distinct from other species as we may think. So to tackle this question of human distinctiveness, one approach that scientists have taken is at the behavioral level, and many of you may already be familiar with this, right? So tool making, or empathy, or deception, or conflict resolution. These are all things that at various times scientists put forth as markers of humanity, right? Something that maybe distinguishes us from other species. But it's now widely appreciated that these are present in many other animals, particularly primates, but even some species that we don't tend to think are very closely related to us at all. The more we learn, the fuzzier it seems to get in terms of how we cleanly distinguish ourselves behaviorally from other animals. Don't get me wrong, we definitely differ in degree in many areas. Okay, and we exhibit some traits more or less than other species. And a prominent example of this that you might hear about is cooperativity, right? But the general principles are not uniquely human. We can see those principles being played out in other species as well. So then some have tried to move beyond the behavioral and try to define human distinctiveness anatomically or morphologically, right, by our shape and size. But this too has proven to be problematic. For example, it's long been known that humans have certain asymmetries in our brain. We call these left-right asymmetries that contribute to certain cognitive functions that we associate with humans. And for decades, we actually thought these features were uniquely human. But it turns out that an increasing number of studies show, particularly in the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years, that these left-right brain asymmetries are shared by other vertebrates and even some other invertebrates. Okay, so this is not uniquely human. It's not to say that there is nothing at all that separates us biologically. For example, this is kind of a cool thing, at the cellular level, something really interesting has been noted about human dendrites. Who knows what dendrites are? Great, so roughly half in here. For those of you who may not be as familiar, they're kind of these arborous extensions of a neuron in the brain. They help communicate signals in the brain, right? So it's one of the mechanisms by which neurons might talk to each other and aggregate signals. And it turns out that human dendrites are much bigger and they're much longer than any other animal we've ever studied, including monkeys. And it's been suggested that this distinction could hold the clues to some of our unique cognitive capabilities. And I think this is really interesting. There's no doubt that it merits deeper investigation. But really, at the end of the day, it's just another example of a difference in degree, right? It's not as though other species don't have dendrites. Ours is just maybe qualitatively a little different, right? So that's not particularly satisfying, even for scientists who are on the quest to really try to understand what it is that conceptually separates us from other species, okay? The second lesson is that we are not as physically independent from other species as we assume. So the first lesson, right, was we're not as biologically distinct. And the second is we aren't even as physically independent from other species as we often assume. Many of you might know this, but one of the most remarkable discoveries, and this gets closer to some of the work done in my lab, is that our bodies are home to tens of trillions of microbes, right? If you put that in another way, slightly more than half the cells in a human body are not human at all. Most of these microbes, they're bacteria, they're viruses, but did you know that some of them are actually fungi, or fungi, as some people say? You may be used to thinking of fungus in like the context of a medical condition, or maybe food you eat, right? Or maybe even something you drink. But across the human population, hundreds of fungal species that they take up normal residence in our body, the gut being a prominent example. And amazingly, these bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, it's not just that they're there, but they're actually really critical for promoting our good health, right? And our physical and mental well-being. Because what's more is they seem to be really crucial in helping control things like anxiety, our mood, and certain behaviors, okay? So there's this relationship that we have with the microbes inside of our body that is extraordinarily intricate and complicated, and it's as though we can't even extricate ourselves from these critters to think about who we are biologically. Another really compelling example, right, and this is one of my favorites since I do think about genomics and our DNA a lot, it comes from examining DNA. You might expect that, okay, well, you know what, you talked about behavior, you talked about anatomy, you talked about cells in the body, but let's get down to brass tacks. If we just look at the DNA, then that's fully human, right? Your DNA is your human DNA, right? Shouldn't that be the end of the story? Well, it turns out that we have a bit of a problem there too. Speckled throughout our genome are these genetic sequences that actually originated from viruses. And this is because certain viruses, when they infect a host, they can actually integrate their genetic material into that of the host. This is not true of all viruses, but some can do this. Okay. So in fact, careful analysis has suggested that at least, so this is a minimum number, at least 10% of our human genome represents sequences from viruses that have integrated into our DNA over time. This is pretty phenomenal if you just stop and think about it. At the DNA level, even at the genetic level, you might say we are 1/10 virus. Right? And again, it's not just that it's there. It's that we have co-opted some of these viral origin sequences for really, really critical and important functions. For example, there is growing evidence to suggest that pieces of viral DNA in the human genome, right, have contributed to the development of the human placenta. Every time I say that, I get goosebumps because it's just fascinating. Viral DNA may have helped bring about an organ that we now know is absolutely critical for nourishing a growing baby in the human womb. Right? So it is, I don't know about you, but that's mind-blowing to me. And I've actually been interacting with these data for a long time. So, not as biologically distinct, not as physically independent. And the third lesson is we might not even be as materially special as we like to feel. What do I mean by that? Carl Sagan is one of the world's most brilliant astrophysicists. He once said that the cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. And he meant this quite literally because it's true. We are indeed made of the stuff of stars. 99% of our physical bodies is comprised of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The remaining 1%, it includes things like magnesium and calcium. Where do these elements come from? The answer is, as Carl Sagan said, the stars. Early in the life of stars, they're comprised mostly of hydrogen. Nuclear fusion of hydrogen leads to the production of helium. A special process of helium fusion brings about carbon. And in very large stars, subsequent addition of helium elements gives rise to oxygen, magnesium, iron, so on. And during supernovas, which are essentially these magnificent explosions of large stars, all of these elements are released into interstellar space. And that provides the raw material for new stars to be birthed, for planets to come about, and maybe even for life on those planets to come about, form, develop. So everything we're made of was first inside stars. So to summarize, science has taught us that we are strikingly similar to other creatures. We're surprisingly dependent on other species, even fungus. And even more, you could think of us as just being made of stardust. Right? So the bottom line is biology has brought to light a fundamental connectedness among different life forms and even links all of us intimately to the air we breathe, the earth we walk on. And some have argued that this points to the insignificance of humankind. In fact, Stephen Hawking, he famously said, "We are just chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting round a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies." It's a bleak view. And this is not unlike, though, the sentiment that was shared by Carl Sagan, who said, "Who are we humans? Well, we find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star, lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than there are people." I think he felt Stephen Hawking wasn't bleak enough. Took it to the next level. What I really want you to appreciate here is that Sagan and Hawking, they are taking big leaps from talking about the facts of science, which we've just been doing for 10, 15 minutes, to inferring something from that about the significance of humankind. Right? There's a leap, there's a jump that they're taking there. They suggest that the material or physical place in the universe shows that we're not significant. Are they right? They're brilliant scientists, so when they make a proposal, I do think it's worth considering. Are they right in what they're saying? If science is the sole arbiter of truth, then I might be tempted to agree with them. But as it turns out, science only offers an explanation for one dimension of reality. And I say that as a scientist with all due respect to science. This is actually demonstrated quite elegantly by an illustration provided by John Polkinghorne. He's a prominent theoretical physicist at Cambridge before becoming an Anglican priest. How many people know John Polkinghorne? Syman knows John Polkinghorne. By the way, Syman's pedigree there was so impressive, I'm afraid you might be listening to the wrong person tonight. But John Polkinghorne, if you don't know him, go read up on him. He is one of the most influential thinkers at the intersection of science and faith that I've ever come across in my lifetime so far. He passed away in 2021, I believe. He was considered one of the most foremost thought leaders, not only in physics, not only in religious thought, but in science and faith, as I said. His illustration starts with a simple question. What is the explanation for a tea kettle, right? A tea kettle that is boiling on a stove? One explanation is the scientific one, is that the burning gas heats the water, right? That's why you're seeing what you're seeing. But what he says is that only answers the question of how. Another explanation is that the water is boiling because someone wanted tea. Right? That's an answer to the question on a very different dimension. That gets at the question of why. Right? Science can tell us what happens, how it happens, but that's only part of the story. It can't tell us the purpose, the meaning. For that, we need to look beyond science, if there is anything at all. The important point is, science does not constrain us to look only to science in our explanation of human distinctiveness. Right? To respect something is to respect the power of what it can do, but also to respect its limitations. Right? And so that's the problem here that we have with science, is that we make these leaps from what the data tell us to these answers to questions about meaning and purpose that science itself is agnostic with respect to. The atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett, some of you may know him, he once said, like other animals, we have built-in desires to reproduce and to do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal. But we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. Our ability to devote our lives to something we deem more important than our own personal welfare is one of the things that set us aside from the rest of the animal world. This is one of the most prominent atheists in the modern day. He goes on to say that he does believe that science will one day provide the explanation. But I ask, could it be that, like the boiling kettle, science only has part of the answer? Okay? Specifically, what might the Christian scriptures have to offer about this concept of human distinctiveness? So I'm going to start in Genesis 2. Humans are created from the dust of the ground, which is exactly the way the formation of other animals is actually also described. The book of Ecclesiastes actually says, just as the animals, from dust we came, and to dust we shall return. So when it comes to the stuff we're made of, whether we're talking about science or scripture, genetics or Genesis, it seems we can't really escape that we're basically dust, maybe stardust. But then, Psalm 8, 3 through 5, it cuts through with one of the most glorious set of verses in all of Scripture to me. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. The great American novelist Marilyn Robinson, she wrote the following about these verses. Psalm 8, 3 through 5 closes the infinite distance between God and humankind by confounding all notions of scale. If the great heavens are the work of God's fingers, what is small and mortal man? The poem answers its own question this way. Man is crowned with honor and glory. He is, in a singular sense, what God has made him because of the dignity God has conferred upon him, splendor of a higher order. In other words, the significance of humanity does not arise primarily from our material bodies, nor our physical place in the universe, but rather in the value that God himself places upon us, the value that he chooses to place upon us. Why does he choose to do this? It turns out that it has very little to do with who we are or the material stuff we're made of, and everything to do with who he is, his character. He chooses to value us. He even chooses to partner with us as his image bearers and invites us to stand in awe at what he's done. Let's look at some verses that address this. Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Psalm 65:8. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Job 37:14. Stop and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know how God lays his command upon them and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know how he balances the clouds and the many wondrous works of him? Psalm 139:13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. By the way, remember when I said earlier that pieces of viral DNA may have helped bring about an organ that nourishes a human body, the placenta? To me, that doesn't take away from God's authorship of our lives. Instead, it adds a wonderfully surprising color to the truth of Psalm 139:13, that God knit us together in our mother's wombs. Who is to say that God can't accomplish that, in part through viruses? Certainly not me. These verses, they reveal a core truth of the Christian faith as I see it, that we're called to wonder at what he's made, to be in awe. Humankind is that unique slice of creation that gets to delight in its creator right alongside the creator. We uniquely get to peer into and make known what Ephesians 3:10 calls the manifold wisdom of God. Human distinctiveness is less about the material stuff that we're made of and more about the unique experience of drawing nearer to God in the study of all that he has made. Right? For me, at the end of the day, this is what the scientific enterprise is actually about. Properly viewed, in the light of our calling as images of God, the exploration of the natural world, or science, it doesn't detract from my humanity. It actually encourages it. It persuades me every day to open my eyes to the overabundance, you might even say the prodigal amount, right, of created things all around us, the sheer vastness of the created order, the diversity and the complexity of created things. It's awe-inspiring. And I think we're meant, uniquely, to stop and be in awe of those things. And it's harder than ever in our very fast-paced, go, adrenaline-filled culture, right? It's really hard to do that. But I actually think that's one of the unique callings of humanity, to stop and wonder. We're meant to explore, to be in awe in a way that no other animal is. As creatures made in the image of God, God extends to us an invitation to consciously enjoy creation. It's an invitation to not only to stand and stare at the wonder and mystery of the created world, but I think, for some of us anyway, to also dive in and start to explore it. And I think that's what a scientist is. I'll share an aside here. Johannes Kepler is one of my kind of scientific heroes. He was a devout Christian and a brilliant mathematician. And he's credited with uncovering the laws of planetary motion. And in one of his theses, he actually starts by saying that he views his purpose in life to think God's thoughts after him, and when even just a little bit is revealed to him through his study, to then go and celebrate that with others. That's basically what he thought being a scientist meant. Right? So, as a response to this invitation to be in awe, to celebrate, in this next and final part of the lecture, I actually want to share with you 3 different genomics stories of wonder. So we're just going to go on a little genomics ride here, and I just hope that you enjoy what you hear. There's nothing more to this other than an invitation for you to be in wonder together with me. So the first draft of the human genome, it was completed at the turn of the millennium. It was a little over 20 years ago. The announcement was made from the White House, and the president at the time, President Bill Clinton, he referred to the genome as, quote, the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind. The sequencing of the human genome, it unveiled what you might call an instruction booklet for every cell in the body. It's truly amazing. But we did not know how to interpret the instructions, right? Because the language, it was written in a way that was largely unknown to us. We didn't understand the patterns. What was actually encoded in the genome? Right? That's been the work of the last 20 years. Right? How does it work, and what does it teach us about the human body and maybe our inclinations and penchant for certain traits and diseases? The word genome, it literally means a collection or a compendium of genes. But it turns out we don't have nearly as many genes as we once thought we did. Before this kind of genome era of science, we thought we might have 100,000 genes, maybe more, maybe lots more. But by studying the full genomic sequence, we learned that we have about 20,000, right, depending on how you count. Even the genome of rice, the rice we eat, has close to 50,000 genes. Right? So when it comes to the number of genes we have in our DNA, we don't even hold a candle to rice. In fact, we now know that genes, depending on exactly how you define them, they constitute about 2% of the human genome, and that's being generous. What is encoded in the remaining 98%? It's what some once called the dark matter of the genome, right? Sort of analogous to dark matter in space, perhaps. But it turns out that a lot of it is filled with what we call DNA switches, or they're probably better referred to as dials or rheostats. You can walk into a room and you can kind of dial the temperature up and down or the light up and down. There are tons of these kinds of dials that are found throughout our genome. They're not genes themselves, but they're important for controlling when, where, and how much nearby genes are turned on, right? So they're regulators, if you will. Right? So again, with that room analogy, they're not the rooms themselves, right, where certain things might happen, certain functions might exist, but they are controlling the lighting in the room and the other aspects of the room. Okay, so if you think of genes as tools that we have in our toolkit as humans, it turns out that biological complexity of an organism isn't really determined by the number of tools the genome has, but rather by when, where, and how those tools are used. Right? So that's a really interesting nuance that I think is worth reflecting on, meditating on. And I've done that, and I've found that this is really an interesting sort of parable for spiritual life. There's a lesson here. It's not how many skills and talents I have, so that I might sit around comparing myself to someone else, but rather it's when and how I choose to use whatever it is that I do have that builds the kingdom of God, right? That I choose to use what I have for the sake of others above myself. That's really where the action is, right? Not just in thinking about how many different talents I have or how many different things I'm good at. The second sort of story of wonder is about this concept of epigenetics. How many people heard about epigenetics? All right, great. So a little more than half. So, earlier I referred to the genome as a set of instructions, right? Every cell in the human body has the same set of instructions, more or less, the same DNA. Well, if the DNA is the instructions, and every cell has the same set of instructions, how in the world does a heart cell know to do something different than a brain cell, than a skin cell, or than an intestinal cell, right? I'm glad that it does, but how does it know to do that if it has the same set of instructions? It turns out that while the cells have all of these instructions, they don't execute all of them. They're programmed to know which set of instructions to follow and which set of instructions to leave aside for another cell to worry about, right? How it knows that, right, is the study of the wonderful and beautiful process of organismal development, right? That we go from one cell to this complex multicellular being with well-formed organs and all of this that are performing their own functions as part of a larger body. Developmental biology is just an extraordinarily fascinating arena, and there's still so much we don't understand. Okay, but epigenetics is a really important concept as we talk about this area. So if you stretched out DNA, you took out DNA from a single cell, and you stretched it out, it'd be about 6 feet, which is taller than me, I'm sad to say, okay? And if you took DNA from all the cells of our body and you lined it up, right, it would be hundreds of millions of miles. I've known this for a while, and it is just mind-boggling to me. That is a ton of physical stuff, material stuff and physical information packed within one body, right? Very, very tightly wound and packaged within the cells of one body. And there are certain chemical marks that can be made on the packaging material, the thing that allows the DNA to be so compact. Well, you can make some chemical marks to that packaging material, and it's those chemical marks that end up providing the indications to the cell of whether or not to execute the underlying instruction or whether or not to ignore it and leave it aside, right? And so it's in this wondrous process of development that as you kind of go down certain lineages, the lung and the heart and the brain, the intestine, there are different segments of the genome that are getting laid down with different sets of marks, right? So that these cells, when they are mature, they know what they're supposed to be doing and what to ignore, right? It's just phenomenal. But what's really remarkable is that the environment around us, the lifestyle choices we made, the diet we have, these things can actually change the chemical marks. And by changing the chemical marks, they can actually change the function of the underlying DNA without touching the DNA at all. I'm not talking about mutations to our genome. I'm talking about how chemical marks to the packaging material can now suddenly tell a cell that you should execute this instruction when normally you shouldn't. Right? So environmental influences, exposures to certain chemicals, the diet that we have and the accumulation of certain chemicals in our body, all of these things can influence the marks that are placed on the packaging material of our DNA. Right? And not only that, it's been proposed that certain kinds of marks on the packaging material can actually potentially be passed on to the next generation. I want to be really clear that we think that this is probably the vast minority of the different kinds of chemical marks that are out there that could be passed down. And we still don't fully understand or appreciate the detailed mechanisms by which that might happen, okay? But it is an active area of research right now. It's pretty well appreciated in plants and worms. We've sort of seen it happen in mice, and now we're conjecturing and studying whether this can really happen and to what extent and how in human beings. Right? But it's a provocative question because could we be passing on to our children not only our DNA, but also sort of a molecular history of the social and physical environments we've been exposed to? Right? I, again, want to stop and, a lot of the times when people talk about this kind of area, there's sensationalism, right? And articles that you might read in the press, they'll run with this idea and say that everything you do is being passed down or something like that. That's not at all what I'm saying. The vast majority of these chemical marks that I'm talking about, we have no reason to believe that they're actually inherited. But there are certain kinds, a small subset, that are impacted by the environment that we think can be transgenerationally inherited. And so that's what we're trying to study and get into the detailed mechanisms of how. The third and final story of wonder is about this concept of randomness. And this can be unnerving for some people. It is apparent that randomness is inherent to many phenomena in genetics and biology. And it's often unsettling because it seems like if it's just stochastic and random, can there really be any purpose or meaning to life? There's a world-leading neuroscientist at Stanford University. His name is Bill Newsome. If you haven't come across some of what he's talked about, I encourage you to check it out. He also happens to be a serious and committed Christian. He was once asked, how can a process that depends on chance be an intentional creative act of God to create human life in his or her image? And his response I thought was really winsome. He said, easily, scientists regularly harness random events in the service of purposeful ends. Think genetic programming, quantum computing. So if we can do it, I think God is certainly up to the challenge, is what Bill said. One of the most stunning truths in biology is that apparently random processes, they lead to ordered, predictable outcomes all the time. Okay? A compelling example of this, and it's another wonder, is the formation of each of our human bodies in our mother's womb. That is the process by which each of us develops from a single cell to a whole organism. It's been said that our cells play dice en route to becoming a fully formed heart cell or liver cell or lung cell. But despite this underlying, quote, randomness, at the end of the process, a human body emerges every time. Of course, the human bodies are a little different. I've already indicated to you I wish I were a little bit taller, right? But it's a human body nonetheless. How does this happen? There was an article published in Nature quite a few years ago now that it provided a really poetic answer, and I want to read it out to you. If cells play dice, various geometric and temporal constraints on the cells can weight the dice, thus disrupting perfect randomness to convert noise into orchestrated sounds. In other words, even random processes are constrained by the parameters of the system in which they operate, and these constraints actually help shape the possibilities of the final outcome. Randomness does not imply lack of order or purpose, at least the way that scientists usually talk about it. Instead, random processes operating under specified constraints, which I believe are authored by God, they can actually weave a very beautiful tapestry like the human population, right? I'm grateful for that randomness and stochasticity because that's what leads to the diversity that we see in this room right now, which is something we ought to celebrate. So at the beginning of this lecture, I introduced the idea that we are not as biologically distinct from other species as we may think. But I think if you see that through the lens of the Christian faith, it's actually a reminder that we are part of a family that we're actually called to care and tend for. I also said that we are not as physically independent from other species as we assume. But again, if you see it through the lens of the Christian faith, it's a reminder that we belong to one ecological body. It's a body with many parts, right? An analogy that Paul uses too, each with a responsibility toward another. And finally, I propose that we are not as materially special as we like to feel. But again, seen through the lens of faith, this is actually a reminder that we are called to be in awe of the universe that we inhabit. So the next time you read Psalm 19:1 or it comes up in a church service or something like that, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. My hope is that you will stand in wonder not only at God's awesome power, but also that in his wisdom, we humans, said to be made in his image, are also stardust. The author of the Bible Project, Tim Mackey, he recently said on a BioLogos podcast, humans are meant to represent a mix of both earth and heaven. I think this is another way of saying stardust and wonder. Science is really powerful for providing a better understanding of the earth and the stardust part of who we are. But for the heaven or the wonder part of who we are, I think we have to look upward to our Maker, because he's the one who confers upon us that dignity and splendor of a higher order. Thanks a lot for having me.
All right. Evening, friends. Thanks for being here. My name is Syman. I graduated from Furman longer ago than I'd like to admit right now, but we had CLPs back then. We did not have CLPs like this, so I'm glad this kind of conversation is happening. So thanks to everyone who made it happen. Thanks, Praveen, for being here. This is great. So, of course, the idea now, despite the cameras between you all and us, is to get to have a bit of a conversation. So, given the number of topics Praveen has already touched on, I'm sure you have several questions already on a whole range of different issues. But for some reason, I don't know if it's alumni benefits or what, but I get to go first. So you're going to have to listen to me, interview Praveen for a few minutes. Hopefully that gives you even more ideas of what you'd like to ask. But I'm excited to save a lot of the time for you all to engage. So we hope to have a real conversation with you here. Praveen, thanks a lot. That was great.
You're welcome.
And yeah, touched on so many different things. I'd like to start with a question on, I don't know, maybe call it the Keynote Question, a question on your title here. Stardust and Wonder. You did a great job outlining ways that science might make it look like we're not so special or different. You use these quotes by people like Hawking and Sagan to show just how bleak it could look if that's all you took was the scientific story. And you spoke against that very, very convincingly. So I think where I'd like to start is how did we get to where we need a talk like this in the first place? So where do we get this idea that when science explains something or describes something, that's all there is to it, nothing more? Do you think we're unique in that globally? Like, is this true among cultures? Is it just a human thing? Or do you think we're unique in that historically? Is it more of a modern thing? Why do we need to talk like this? How did we get here in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Simon, and I think we could probably fill the rest of the evening talking about that question. But before I get to that, I do want to say Simon is someone I've known for 15 years and never actually met until today. Every year I learn that we have 5 or 10 more friends in our mutual kind of circle. I was beginning to wonder if he was real, frankly, because I've never met him. So this is actually a pleasure in many ways for me. I really like that question because I think it motivates us to look at our history a little bit. We tend to think that the times we're in are unique. And don't get me wrong, there are aspects of the time we're in that are quite unique, right? And they mostly have to do with technology. But this notion of, what really is the arbiter of truth, we've gone through so many cycles of this in human history, right? So if you just think about the Western world, right, there was this period of time in the kind of Dark Ages. That name, by the way, is not fair to things that happened during that period that were revelatory and stimulating intellectually. But still there was a perception, right, that there was a lot of blind faith, not a lot of thinking, and just sort of trusting whatever was going to be said by the church or the religious order of the time. And so partly in response to that comes this period of the Enlightenment, right? That says, no, it's rational thought and scientific thinking and logic and mathematics. These are the things that are going to take us to the promised land. These are the things that are going to actually tell us what's true and what's not, right? And this kind of like pendulum swinging, it happens a lot in history, right? And I think we're in a moment of it right now, right? But it's very reactionary to where we were. And then we come sort of guns a-blazing and saying, no, we got to go all the way to the other side, right? And then, because after the Enlightenment, what comes into play? The Romantic period, right? Well, then they say, well, maybe all of truth isn't really held within science and logic. There's such a thing as beauty and instinct and art and literature and poetry and things that don't really neatly fall under, logical propositions, and there's truth to be found there too. So I'm sharing all of this because I think it's important to be a student of history no matter what your major and what your study is, because you can begin to see that history rhymes, right? It doesn't look exactly like that, but I think this is just what we do as humanities. We care a lot actually about this question of who we are and what is truth, right? You go all the way back to Pilate's time, standing, before Jesus, right? And he says, what is truth? He wants to know what truth is, right? Because Jesus is talking about truth, and he goes, what is this thing, truth? So I think we all really desperately want to know whether we're, whether we're open to what we need to do to find out is a different matter, right? But I think that we have cared a lot. So this is really, Simon, I think that this is something that has rhymed. We just happen to find ourselves in that point in the history of humankind in the Western culture, I think, right? Because you also ask what's going on in the rest of the world. Yeah. I do think we're exporting this problem to some extent, right? But if you listen to N.T. Wright, he'll actually talk about how some of the issues that we're grappling with right now, there are a lot of places he goes in the world where he does not see it as prominently problematic, right? This whole notion of science and its vibrant Christian faith with this beautiful viewing science as something, as a wondrous opportunity that God has given us to explore the natural world he has made, as opposed to an opponent. So, I don't want to get into too much of why I think it might be why we might be in that moment here in America. I do think that if you follow our politics and our history, you might see why we find ourselves in this moment in time. But no, I don't think that this is mirrored everywhere else. Although as a very influential nation, I do think we're exporting the problem.
Thanks a lot. I introduced the question, in terms of this tendency we have to think that when science says something, that's all there is to be said. Interestingly, another way, I like your point about pendulum swinging, another way I see it show up is not just thinking that a scientific description is all there is to say, but even looking to science or scientists for answers to questions that really fall in a different domain entirely, right? So theological or philosophical questions, and yet for some reason we'll often look to the scientist and think surely they would know because they're a scientist, and so they know everything, right? So we had this tendency to kind of glorify that whole pursuit. So the place I saw this show up perhaps most in my life, and it was a very encouraging example actually, was Alex mentioned earlier that I got to work in the very early days of a group called the BioLogos Foundation, just getting it started, setting up a website, this kind of thing. The founder, Francis Collins, had just written a book called The Language of God, and he was receiving emails and handwritten letters by the dozens every week, very sincere questions about faith that were sparked by something in his book. And Francis is the kind of guy who's working 80 hours a week at the NIH and yet cares enough that he's really trying to respond to some of these, and he thinks, no, I can't do this, I can't keep up, I need some other way to respond to these questions. And in trying to set up a website as a way to answer these questions, what I loved and what I appreciated so much about his approach, which brings it to this question, is he recognized that he was getting theological and philosophical questions from a wide range of people, and they all figured that because he's a geneticist and also had this other doctorate in quantum mechanics, he must know everything. And so let's ask him our theology and philosophy questions too. And he very wisely pulled together a group of advisors with a much wider background, theology, philosophy, et cetera, and got a lot of great feedback on the kind of answers. So one thing I really appreciate about BioLogos, I'm saying, is that I think it's a good example of how to look elsewhere for answers to these questions, not always straight to science. Anyway, but just another example of how that pendulum has swung a bit.
Yeah, and Syman, when you were talking, I was thinking of Blaise Pascal, right? So some of you, if you're religion or philosophy or theology majors, maybe you read a little bit of Blaise, one of the greatest Western mathematicians of all time. He's going to be in that list if someone makes one. But he was incredibly thoughtful because he never assumed, and in fact, he actively worked against this idea that logical propositions were all there was to truth and to our human experience. Right? He said that's just not being honest about our day-to-day life. Right? There are things that we take for granted and we know are true, like space and time and things like that we take as postulates and axioms just by virtue of existing. And we know these things, he said, by heart, but what he meant was by kind of instinct, right? There are different ways of knowing things, he said, and if we just limit our way of knowing to just one thing, which is scientific pursuit or mathematical explanations, then we are flattening our reality to just a single dimension. It's a powerful dimension, but we are much more than that. Why would we want to flatten ourselves, was the way that Blaise talked about it.
Thanks. Okay, back to the title here, Stardust and Wonder. So I think you did a good job reminding us what kind of a role we're called to play in a posture of wonder toward creation or toward our Creator. And if we really follow that and live it out, you would expect a lot of Christians to become scientists because wonder plays a big part in science. You got to be at least somewhat curious to want to do some kind of research to understand something more deeply, the way that science leads you to do. And yet, there's a certain tension there, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. It seems like, okay, for the record, I don't actually believe what I'm about to say, but I'll say it just to bring up the tension. It might seem like the purpose of science is to resolve the wonder or do away with it. So we're curious about something, we don't see how this works or how it could happen, let's do some science, we get a scientific description, no need to wonder anymore, we've got it figured out, which is quite different than the kind of reaction you described Kepler having with the real joy that comes out of discovery and actually seeing that as thinking God's thoughts after him. So you're a scientist. Help me understand a little more about the role that wonder plays in your life as a Christian and as a scientist, to kind of keep speaking against this idea that science would just take your wonder and then give an explanation to do away with it, to be done, right?
Yeah, I think for me, because I do come at science from a faith-based worldview, because I do believe in a creator God and in a God who has made everything that I'm looking at and studying, to me, whatever it is that I'm exploring and discovering is like scratching the surface of some aspect of who God is, right? It's like when Paul says in scriptures that, he is to be found all around us, right? If you just know where to look, you can see the fingerprints of God. And so as a scientist, to explore the natural world and to actually be able to come up with how certain things work, to me, as Francis and many other scientists have said in the past, that's like a worship moment, right? Where you go, whoa, so that's how you did it. Cool. That's really interesting, right? Like what Kepler said, like thinking God's thoughts after him, right? So that's what I mean when I say that science is an opportunity to worship, because it's a chance to learn just a tiny bit more about who he is, right? But then you could ask, well, listen, like there are scientists that love what they do and they wonder at what they do and they're not Christians, right? I think a part of that is because even the world that we're exploring is so beyond our comprehension, right? Like we think we're so advanced in our knowledge, but we've actually just scratched at the surface of knowledge, right? I actually tell my students, my PhD students all the time, sophistication in science isn't measured by how much you know. It's actually measured by how much you realize you don't know, right? So I think a lot of sophisticated scientists, even without a faith-based worldview, go, whoa, there is so much more here than I even comprehended when I first started. And even that can lead to a certain kind of wonder, right? To me, there's an added wonder because ultimately it points to the Creator God. Yeah, I don't know if that gets at the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Thanks. No, good. All right, I'm going to jump around here a little bit because you touched on so much. So, human distinctiveness. So, when I think of human distinctiveness, I don't know what it is about my background or studies. I jump straight to the soul. It's just one of the first things that comes to my mind. What, if anything, can science tell us about the soul? Let me start there.
Yeah. I don't know if anything can really tell us very much about the soul. I mean, the soul is this question or this topic that is shrouded in mystery. It really is. I mean, we've had philosophers and theologians and devout believers and secularists and all kinds of people delving into this question of the soul with many answers as there have been people to delve into it, right? So that tells me that there's something kind of mysterious about it, actually. There is a mystery there. If you're interested in the idea of what soul means from a Genesis standpoint, I actually recommend to you a book by a good friend and an amazing theologian, Richard Middleton. He has a book called The Liberating Image. He's an Old Testament scholar. He's a professor up in upstate New York at Roberts Wesleyan. And he's done a lot of careful exegesis and study of Genesis and related texts, putting it into the Near Eastern context and helping it sort of giving us a fuller theology if you look at it into the broader kind of trajectory of Scripture and all this amazing stuff. And I really strongly encourage you to check it out. But one of the things that Richard talks about in there is this idea that, a lot of people have interpreted as animals having souls, right? And so he actually takes this tack that, not that the soul isn't an interesting question to him, but he actually feels that it's not really, at the end of the day, depending on how you read Genesis, contributing to human uniqueness or distinctiveness. That it actually is this notion of the image of God, which he uncouples from the soul. Because he says that the image of God, it may require a soul, but he uncouples it in terms of what it really is. It's a vocation. It's a specific calling placed upon us that God has not placed upon any other species that he has made. So he loves everything he's made, but he places a calling upon us to reflect him, to represent him, to be like him on this earth, right? And that's the image of God, right? And so really, I've found it to be a really powerful way to think about it. I'd be careful about being dogmatic about any of these positions because I think if it were that clear, we would have some consensus.
But it's Q&R, not Q&A.
Exactly right. But I propose that as something for you to ponder on because it's been really interesting for me to think about.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks. That was a really great summary, especially this other work you mentioned. I think it's a good reminder also of the different way that we approach questions, the kinds of answers we may expect now compared to the kinds of questions that an ancient Near Eastern culture would have been getting out of the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
So, especially your point about the image of God not necessarily being something distinctly metaphysically different about our soul versus an animal soul, maybe not even something distinct about our physical makeup, or even that we physically look or can move or function like God, but that the image of God is actually a role for us to play.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm even oversimplifying your comments even more, but it's a really striking example of how differently the questions are being approached, or what kinds of questions are being addressed at the time. Whereas we would approach a text like that and just kind of look for our scientific answers, right?
Yes,
Give me something I could put my finger on as to exactly what makes me have the image of God, without even recognizing that it could be something relational, or some kind of a responsibility or role for me to play that would be the image. Anyway,
That's
so
right.
Grid. You were going to jump in there.
No, I was going to riff a little bit off
All
of the penultimate thing you said there, which is, this might be from Richard too, but this notion of the image of God, so the Hebrew word for that is the same word that is used when a king of the Israelites, when he could not be physically present in a particular part of the kingdom, an image would be constructed that was supposed to represent the full power and ability and might of the king in that place, right? And that's evocative. That's the same word used to describe who we are in relation to God, right? So it's like this, again, this notion of us representing him. God isn't physically here, but we are, and we're representing him and reflecting him on this earth, exercising his will and reflecting his character. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to look to you all to help us in the conversation. So I'm eager to hear from you. But on a different topic. But again, you covered so much. So your last example of wonder about chance, you mentioned how, in some ways that could seem uncomfortable, or it would come across uncomfortable to some. How could God be working in the world if there's so much chance everywhere? It seems chaotic, unpredictable. And it's interesting because in my physics background, I actually came to that kind of a question from the other side of the spectrum. Yeah. So for me, it was, well, look, if my laws of physics, which I can describe using mathematics, if they can describe the way the world behaves so well that they can even predict the way the world's gonna behave in a certain situation, well, then there's no room for a God to be involved because everything's following these rules. And what room is there for God in a fully deterministic world, we'd call it, right? So it's interesting to hear you describing this other tension from the other end of the spectrum. Well, how could God be involved if everything is so chance related? Yeah. So for me, the introduction to chance was actually very interesting, as something that might open up perspectives beyond my kind of mechanistic, machine-like view of the world. I don't know. So say a little bit more about that, though. Are we still? It seems like perhaps we're still on either end of the spectrum. I suppose we're still falling for this trap in thinking that if science gives an explanation, either fully mechanistic or entirely chaotic and chance-based, that that means that that's the full story and there's nothing else to it, or there isn't room for God in our understanding of things.
I think it's really fascinating, Syman, because there have been people, like a lot of the Western scientists who actually were people of faith, whether it's Galileo, right, or physicists that we talk about who made all kinds of amazing discoveries, who did this, like Kepler, for example. He said he was motivated. He knew that there had to be laws, he said. He didn't know if he was ever going to uncover them, but he felt strongly motivated by the hypothesis that there were laws because of the God he worshipped. That God is a God of order, and that he wasn't just going to set up this like fully chaotic system. On the other hand, I think you've had people, incredibly thoughtful people. Asa Gray comes to mind, who was a American life scientist, was one of the pen pals of Charles Darwin, actually, and he was a devout believer. But he was actually really tickled by the idea of there being chance in sort of integrated into the ways in which the world might have come about, but ultimately still authored by God, right? Because the way he thought about it was, Syman, the way you're saying is, things aren't fully deterministic. We're not robots. The world isn't just, it has creative freedom. God values freedom. God values us expressing ourselves in our own unique and creative ways. And motivated strongly by that belief, ASUS felt strongly that there must be some stochasticity. There must be some chance to allow for the vibrancy of the diversity that we see and all this creative freedom in the natural world and in human beings, etc. Right? So who's right? They're both right. Like, I think it's that we don't want to fall into this trap of just thinking that one of those ways of thinking is right, right? That's just us putting God inside of the box we're comfortable with, right? And trying to shove him in there, right? The reality is God is both those things. And I think the more we can embrace that God is a God of order, but he's also someone who loves, setting things up in a way that allows us to express our creativity within a certain set of specified constraints. It's some kind of beautiful balance of that, right? And you can't just say this is God or that's God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Okay, do we have a mic in the room, or are we just going to raise our voices?
Just got to raise your voice.
Okay. All right, raise a hand and prepare to raise a voice. Yep.
I have a question about, I'm a Christian too, and sometimes when I read the Bible, I try to analyze it a little bit, and I believe it's in Genesis where you have this say Noah's Ark, right? You have Noah and his family, and one of each of every animal species in Noah's Ark. And that's how the New World was populated after God saw the wickedness of man and decided to start over. From a religious standpoint and a scientific standpoint, how do you rationalize events such as those that were documented and that we're taught to believe that everything in the Bible is true? How do you rationalize that from a scientific standpoint while still keeping your faith?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an extraordinarily important question. And I really hope all of you ask that question in some way, shape, or form, because it challenges you. And I think a challenged faith and emerging out from that challenge in community with one another, I mean, that's what MCF is for, I think, right? Is to get into the dirt a little bit with these questions, be a little uncomfortable. I guarantee you do that in community, you do that in prayer. To those of you who identify as Christians, you will come out stronger for it on the other side, right? So thank you for asking the question. What is true what is your name again? Asher. So Asher, what is true is different question actually than what is historical or what is literal or how should this passage be understood. Jesus mentions a parable, right? That parable has an immense amount of value and truth, but it's clearly a story. I know we're not talking about a parable right now. I'm just giving an example of how something can be profoundly true, right? Have immense value for my faith, but not actually be a historical claim necessarily, okay? So the first thing we ought to do when we approach Scripture is read it the way that it was meant to be read. Read it the way that the authors intended for it to be read. Right? That's not necessarily an easy thing to do, so I do think that it takes a lot of intention and effort, but I think we're meant to bring that to the Bible. There's a nice little book called How to Read, and then it's How to Read Genesis, How to Read Job, How to Read, the Book of Acts, right? There's different ones, and it's written by Tremper Longman. He's an Old Testament scholar, professor, theologian out in California. Strongly recommend you check out some of that stuff. I mean, he's one of the most brilliant writers about and expositors on the Old Testament, devout believer and Christian, but provides really, really meaningful and profound ways to actually understand the text of the Old and New Testament within the context of the Near Eastern culture in which they were written. How would this text have actually been read and understood by the people to whom it was written, right? Because it's written for us, but not necessarily to us, right? The first audience for these things were not people with 21st century sensibilities. Right? So that's something we need to take into account as we come to these various texts, right? And I want to leave the answer there because I think it's extremely nuanced, very specific things about okay, how do we read Noah? Exactly how do we understand that? It takes a lot of effort because we need to come to these texts not only with the Near Eastern context in which it was written, but also clues that the text itself provides about the genre that it is. The Bible has poems, has observational language, It has Galileo was put in house arrest, right? Because the Catholic Church decided to interpret something absolutely literally, when now in retrospect, most Christians go, that was clearly poetic, right? That's not the way that was supposed to have been interpreted. Galileo was not wrong about his view of the earth going around the sun, right? But the poetic language about the earth being fixed and immovable, right, led the Catholic Church to think, well, we're gonna, if we say the Bible's true, then that has to be true. Well, yeah, it is true, but exactly how are we meant to read it and understand it, right? You read the book of Ecclesiastes, I mean, it's just full of like rich figurative language. And I think we miss the real meaning if we don't really come to it with that sensibility. It's like, I don't know, if a robot reads Romeo and Juliet, right? Like you're gonna read out the words, but you're just gonna miss all the like meaning and passion and like wonder there, right? So I think that's what we need to be careful about not doing when we come to the Bible. It's so much more than we give it credit for.
Sorry, let's go here first. Thank you.
I'm a biology major, and I enjoyed everything you had to say about the wonder that you feel when you study, because I feel the same thing when I'm in my biology classes, and I'm like, oh my God, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Out of all the things that could have happened, that's how it happened. Through the fact that, that's just the chance that every day, it does the right thing in your body, or your cells do what they're supposed to. But I feel like I have to ask about what I see as the other side of the coin, which is like the cruelty of biology. You can't study bio without learning about everything that goes wrong, or that could go wrong, and how many times a day it does go wrong.
Yeah.
With, like cancer and just all the other stuff that we see in nature.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, how do you deal with that? And do you see that as part of the wonder? Or
Yeah.
is that like outside of the wonder?
My gosh, what a good question. What's your name?
Reagan.
Reagan. Thank you so much for asking that. I want to start by saying I apologize in advance if my answer isn't going to be satisfactory for you, but I hope that it gives you something to chew on and to keep thinking about. And I would love to actually keep talking with you about this. I mean that, because these are the conversations we should be having. Reagan, that has really challenged my notion of what it means to say that something is good. Because I do not believe that the things that we see that are wrong or harmful in biology in the world is a consequence of fallenness or sin. I think that is an easy answer at first, but if you follow that rabbit hole, you get all kinds of problems, and a lot doesn't really line up there, right? So even from a theological and from a scientific standpoint, that doesn't hold a lot of water to me, right? And so I'm left to then wonder, what the heck does it mean that God made these things and made it that way such that cancer can come about and this and that, and then call it good, right? One of the things I've come to understand about what good means is it may not be defined by God in the way that we want it to be. Right? So there is a little bit of a mystery about what it might mean. But to me, fundamentally, it's that the created things that he put in created spaces are doing the things they're supposed to be doing, right? Like it's like to me the basic definition of what it is to be good, right? And that necessarily involves the things we see that are wondrous and beautiful and awesome, and the things that we're like, my gosh, this is devastating, right? Everything from biological to mutations that can lead to cancer to natural disasters, right? But the thing, Reagan, that I keep coming up with every time I find myself struggling with that, and I go through cycles, but every time I'm struggling with that, I also realize without those things, we wouldn't have life as we know it. We actually wouldn't, right? And we can get into the details of why that is, but that has been shown to be true time and time again, whether it's in the biological examples you provided, whether it's in the physical world and plate tectonics and tornadoes and stuff. The life and the diversity that brings about that we celebrate simply wouldn't exist without it, right? And so it just leads me to think that maybe it is a part of the way that it's like God is saying, there is a risk that is inherent to love and life, and that risk is worth it to me. And we can sometimes get angry at God and say, who are you to say whether it's worth it to you or not? And at that point, there is this sense, when Paul says, does the pot say to the claymaker, make me this way, make me that way, right? So I do think at some point there's a surrender that comes as someone who follows God. But yeah, I do think that it's God's way of saying that there is a risk that things can go awry. But there is a chance of something so beautiful that it's worth it. And it's maybe not unlike the way that we decide to get into human relationships, right? Like when I decided to date my wife or to then propose to her, right? I was pretty sure, right? But I don't know, there's this chance of being hurt, right? And those who have been hurt in relationships will really know what I mean by this, right? And then it just feels like this is not worth it. And more often than not, 9 times out of 10, we're back on the horse. Because there seems to be a truth in it is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. And it's almost as though that's what God is saying, right? Is that I want you so bad. And I want to be in relation with you so bad. But I don't want to make robots. And I want to make a world that has this creative freedom. Because that's where real love can transpire. But to do that, there has to be a risk.
Vivian, was it you?
Yeah, my question was very similar, so you don't have to answer it. If it's nothing new. I was wondering about death specifically, because I think about death as important to the cycle of life, with compost and mushrooms. And,
yes.
So how do we see death as something to wonder at, even as something potentially beautiful in its role in that cycle, while also holding up the fallen nature of the
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's helpful to think about it in the a little bit abstract, because when it's the death of a loved one, or or your own death that you're contemplating, it gets real, right? In a way, it's hard to disentangle from thinking about it sort of much more abstractly, conceptually. But if we abstract it out, you're absolutely right. It is not possible to have life without death. If there was no death, we would just overpopulate this earth, and it would just all be done, right? So there is no life without death. You can see this in our life here on Earth. You can see it in the stars, right? It's like, how do new stars come about? Older stars have to die, right? So there is some kind of beauty in this cyclical nature of you're leaving a legacy, right? It's like you die, but you're leaving room for new things to come and thrive, right? And I do think there's a wonder and a beauty in that, because it's bigger than you. It's bigger than you. There's an analogy here maybe I could give. Who knows, gosh, I'm blanking on her name. Amazing writer. But anyway, she was asked this question once of, does it bother you if people don't end up talking about you as one of the greatest of all time, right? Or something like that. And she was like, I mean, are you kidding me? I just see me as one tributary feeding this massive lake that we call human knowledge and experience. And it's just a privilege to be able to do that. And if I die and even that tributary dries up, but I brought about so much life and so many trees and so many things along the way, and that continues on, right? And so there's it's a wonder in thinking about how that's the legacy you leave behind, and it doesn't have to be that you were the lake itself or you were the largest tributary. And so it's kind of an analogy to your question of, it can feel bleak to just think, oh, well, I die and people die and then that's it, right? But I do think it's powerful, even bringing it back to some of the science we talked about. The way we live leaves a legacy. It impacts the next generation and the generation after that. And so I do think there's a wonder and a beauty in that, even though death is involved.
Thanks. Okay, next.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a question that everyone's gonna either right away be like, okay, no, it's definitely this answer or this answer. It's kind of heated, but it's something I've been curious about and would wonder what you have to say on. And it's evolution, not micro but macro evolution, and how that would you say, like, is that in harmony with biblical text, and like is an option to, or is it at odds, and like just explaining through that Genesis 1 and 2,
Yeah.
poem, literal,
Yeah.
all the hot buttons stuff?
Yeah, great question. What's your name?
Annabelle.
Annabelle, it's a great question. Thanks for asking. A couple of times Biologos has come up. Right? I think I mentioned it, Alex mentioned it, Syman mentioned it. Biologos is an organization, and it's biologos.org, so it's easy to find. But it's an organization that has committed itself over the last 15 years to tackle precisely that question, right? How is it possible to be a faithful Christian, one who takes the Bible seriously, and one who believes that the Bible is the authority on all things as it pertains to one's faith, right? And also hold to scientific revelations with respect to evolution, right? Biologos contends, as would I serve in full disclosure on the board of Biologos, and so I'm in alignment with at least the part of their view that those are harmonious. Several books that I would commend to you if you were really interested in this question. One is actually The Language of God that Syman mentioned. Is more of a personal testimony of how Francis Collins came to faith and how he wrestled with science and faith as one of the most preeminent scientists in the country. But it also has a lot for you to think about and wrestle with, and all of us to think about and wrestle with as it pertains to precisely that question. There's another book, it's called Coming to Peace with Science. It's written by Daryl Falk, one of the most just beautiful human beings I think I've ever met.
Yeah.
Simon would probably agree.
Yeah.
Falk is his name, Daryl. Profoundly committed to Christ and the Christian faith, but a scientist himself and has the mind of a scientist and has written really beautifully about how these things are actually harmonious. It's relatively recent, this notion that the ideas presented by science are in conflict and direct opposition to the views of Genesis. It is really, really helpful to look at history a little bit. I'm not at all intending to say that all Christians used to be evolutionists and it's just recently that people have come up with other theories. I'm not saying that, but there's been a rich history of all kinds of really interesting ways of reading and understanding Genesis, well apart from science. We don't want to be conformists, right? We don't want to put science on a pedestal, say we're going to believe whatever it says, and then we'll just make the Bible say whatever science is saying. That is not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying well prior to any of that kind of stuff and going on in science, people were actually looking at Genesis for what it was worth and coming up with extraordinarily diverse, rich interpretations. And across the board, I'm not talking about these were all people that you would think, oh my gosh, they're committed Christians and take the Bible seriously. So I think some of that history is really, really helpful. And then what you begin to realize is there isn't just one way to look at this, quite apart from science itself. And there might actually be much more harmony here than we actually realize. I mentioned Asa Gray. Well, he was at Harvard, and he was pen pals with Darwin when Darwin was coming up with his theory. And he was so taken, Asa Gray was a devout Christian. He was so taken by Charles Darwin's theories, thought it was so beautifully harmonious with the way that he understood God in Scripture, that he said, Charles, you've got to give me this text and I'll circulate it in America. And he said, are you crazy? He's like, they're like religious nuts in America. They're going to crucify me. I don't want any part of that. And Asa said, don't worry. I will talk to people about why I feel like this is actually beautifully harmonious and it does no violence at all to someone's honest faith. So I'm not providing a holistic answer here, Annabelle, but I wanted to give you some tidbits that you could maybe sink your teeth into going forward. Yeah.
Can I'll jump in, if I may. This is one of the few times that I have anything to add to what Praveen could share, only because I think I just want to say how much I feel your question, so I want to relate to it here, and I'll share more in a minute, and then add two other books that were really helpful for me. So when I was an undergrad at Furman, again, I won't share quite how long ago that was, but when I was an undergrad at Furman, I wouldn't have dared to even ask what you've just asked, because with my Southern Christian upbringing, the word evolution or the word Big Bang were simply synonymous with atheism, right? This was the narrative, a scientific narrative that people made up as an alternative to biblical truth. Like this is what I was taught to believe growing up. So I wouldn't have even been comfortable asking the question, right? Or I would have sat next to you and judged you for asking the question because it was just that simple to me, right? And two things that have been really helpful for me as I explore that whole topic in my undergrad and especially my grad student days. One, Praveen's already said it, but it was very helpful to me to gain a better understanding of where we are in our current cultural context, how my Southern Christian upbringing compared to the much broader range of Christian perspectives across the world, and even just historically. So I won't say any more, but that was really helpful to me. Second, I'll just add another book by John Walton,
Yes.
Just for perspective, not to try to push one particular perspective down your throat, but it's a book called The Lost World of Genesis 1. When, is it Asher? Yep. When Asher asked his question and Praveen spoke so eloquently about how you approach Scripture and trying to learn what kind of a message that Scripture was trying to convey and not approaching Scripture to have it answer some other question, that can be hard because it was written in and through a very different culture than the one through which we're reading it right now, right? But that book by John Walton was one of the first times that I felt like I could really put my finger on what likely, what was kind of the unspoken context of that story for its readers that I'm not going to pick up on because I'm a 21st century physics guy. It really helped me recognize the degree, and we've already said it before, the degree to which the role we play in relationship to God was such a critical message in that story. And I was missing that the whole time. And instead, I was looking for answers to a different question. So anyway, I feel it, and I'm glad you could even ask it. And I just wanted to add John Walton's book.
I love that. And just to add, John Walton also has The Lost World of Adam and Eve, which came as a follow-up that I also really, really enjoyed and has a lot to do with some of the questions that were asked. Tim Keller actually really nicely separates this idea of evolutionism and biological evolution. And what Syman is talking about, and it's what triggered me to have this thought, is scientists studying biological evolution, to which I ascribe, made a leap to evolutionism in the same way that I talked about Sagan and Hawking making leaps about the data to then some sort of like meaning or purpose claim, right? Something similar has been done in science, right? But the thing is, we need to be knowledgeable about that and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So evolutionism, right, is not at all in any way, shape, or form consistent with a view of God as the maker and creator of the world. But biological evolution, I don't believe it is discordant with God.